We're in Ephesians, and we're getting to this week and next week a passage on spiritual warfare. Now, in Africa, Latin America, Asia, most places in the world, the idea of spiritual warfare, of a conflict between spiritual good and spiritual evil, is not an unusual concept. Many people in many parts of the world think it really helps them make sense of reality. But we here in the Western world find it a foreign concept. So let's look at this passage. This is the first part. Next week we'll look at another section on this. And let us notice what? We struggle, spiritual warfare. But let's notice who we fight, what we fight, and how we fight. Who we fight? Our struggle is not with flesh and blood, but with spiritual forces of evil. What we fight? The devil's schemes. How we fight? Do everything. All right. First, who do we fight? Yeah, you see here in verse 12, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil. Now, when Paul says this, and he says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, he doesn't mean that we don't wrestle with any flesh and blood version of evil. He's not saying that. I mean, he's not saying that evil doesn't take flesh and blood form. He has struggled with people who imprisoned him and who flogged him and who, stoned him. So he certainly opposed flesh and blood evil. But what he is saying is we wrestle not only with flesh and blood evil. That when evil takes flesh and blood form, war and cruelty and violence and greed and strife and racism and crime and poverty, when it takes those flesh and blood forms, he is saying they participate in something that's above and behind and beyond, that is more than merely human and natural. That the flesh and blood behind it is something that's not flesh and blood. And until you recognize that dimension of evil in the world, you will not be able to understand its depth and its pervasiveness and its intractability. So, that's what he's saying. Now, here in the West, modern Western world, we have trouble with that. Because the modern Western mindset is this, that everything has a natural cause. And therefore, everything has a scientific explanation. And if everything has a natural cause and a scientific explanation, then crime and violence and greed and racism and war and cruelty, all those things must have a natural cause. And what is that natural cause is then? We say it's bad psychological factors, you were not raised right, you weren't educated right, or bad sociological factors, bad social systems. And we say, there's got to be a natural cause to all this, and we can figure it out and we can fix it. That's the Western mindset. Andrew Del Banco, who's one of a great intellectual scholar type who's at Columbia University some years ago, wrote a book called The Death of Satan. And even though he says in the book, I'm a secular liberal, okay, he wrote a book called The Death of Satan, and the first line in the book is this. He says, a gulf has opened in our culture between the visibility of evil and the intellectual resources to cope with it. And then he goes on and says this, that we've jettisoned in the West the idea of cosmic evil or transcendent evil or supernatural evil. We don't believe in that. In fact, we don't even like to use the word evil. And the reason we don't like it is because it implies value judgments and moral absolutes. So we use medical terms. We talk about dysfunction. We talk about pathology. And we don't use moral terminology. But, Del Banco says, as the 20th century has gone on, it's gotten harder and harder to say that holocausts and ethnic cleansing and serial killing is just bad psychological and sociological adjustment. Del Banco turns, in his book, he turns to a very famous interaction. It's in the book, Silence of the Lambs, and of course it was also depicted in the movie, The Silence of the Lambs. It's the place where the young policewoman, Officer Starling, goes to meet for the first time the monstrous serial killer Hannibal Lecter, and she goes to the cell. And she's looking at him and hearing what he's done and says, what happened to him to make him so twisted? What happened to him that he could be so cruel? And he heard her. Big mistake, Starling. And he begins to speak, and this is what he says, and it's very hard to read this without hearing Anthony Hopkins, I know. But, she says, what happened to him to make him so twisted? And Lecter responds, quote, nothing happened to me, Officer Starling. I happened. You can't reduce me to a set of influences. You've given up good and evil for behaviorism, Officer Starling. You've got everyone in moral dignity pants. Nothing is ever anybody's fault. Look at me. Can you stand to say, I'm evil? And Delbanco, who's quoting this, says, modern people, the modern West, cannot answer the monster's question. And he's right. He says, as the 20th century has gone on, well, we said 150 years ago that all evil has got natural causes, scientific causes, psychological, social causes. He says it's wearing thin. One of the things we used to say is that racism and violence comes from a lack of education, a lack of civilization, a lack of culture. It's only primitive, uncivilized, uneducated people are like that. And then we had World War II. And then we had the final solution and the Holocaust and the death camps that arose out of perhaps as educated and as cultured a nation as there was on the face of the earth. And we had Marxism. And Marxism says, the reason for all the problem, it's not psychological or educational, it's social. We have to put the means of production in the hands of the proletariat, not in the hands of the capitalists, but they did. And of course, the proletariat was every bit as oppressive and violent as the capitalists were. And now Marxism has been thrown onto the dustbin of history, basically. And over again, everything that says, it's psychological, it's social, Delbanco says we cannot today in the West account for the depth and pervasiveness of evil. But the Bible doesn't have that problem. The Bible says here's where evil came from. It came from the free will of two races of beings that God created, angels and humans. And some of the angels fell by exercising their free will and turning away from God. And the fallen angels, the devil and his demons, are personal supernatural beings. And then on the other hand, we have the human race, and we turned, and now sin and evil is in our heart. It's deep in our soul, which is still spiritual roots. And therefore, here's what Christianity says. Yes, psychological and sociological factors can aggravate, they can accentuate, and they can shape the innate self-centeredness, the innate self-absorption, the innate blindness and self-delusion, the innate radical insecurity in the human heart. But those factors don't create it. And that stuff that's in the heart, aggravated by the devil, is what makes the world the way it is. So that's enough on that list. Point one, we wrestle not only with flesh and blood. So let me just push this home to you. There is a devil, there are demons. You need to see that. I know there's got to be people listening to me or who will listen to this recording that have a lot of trouble with the idea that there's a personal devil or believing in a personal devil, believing here what the Bible says. But let me suggest four things to you real quick. Number one, if you struggle believing the devil, would you please at least consider that you're being simplistic? New Yorkers want to be sophisticated. New Yorkers want to be nuanced and sophisticated, not crude and unsophisticated. But is it possible that perhaps by not realizing the multidimensionality and the spiritual depth dimension to human evil, you are being simplistic and you are being naive? And not the people who believe in the demons, that they're not being the unsophisticated, crude ones, but you are? Here's a second point. If you struggle with believing in the personal devil, consider that you might be culturally narrow. Because, white Western people have a lot of trouble believing the devil. That's not true of most people in the world. Africa, Latin America, Asia, they have no trouble believing in spirits and demons and things like that. And they've got wisdom too, don't they? I mean, are you really going to just look down at all that wisdom? Why not be open culturally to what other cultures tell you about this? To paraphrase Shakespeare, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your psychologies and sociologies. Here's a third idea that you got to think of. If you struggle with the idea that there's a real devil, personal devil. Do you believe in God? You say, oh yeah, I believe in God. Well, if you believe in God, isn't it a little inconsistent? If you believe in good personal supernatural beings, why there couldn't be bad personal supernatural beings? I mean, where's the isn't that a little inconsistent? But here's the main thing I want to say. If the Bible's true, if the Bible's right about this, and it is, then you will not be able to understand, let alone defeat, on your own, the darkness in your own heart, in your family, in the city, in the world. You won't be able to do that.